Have you ever thought about astrology, using patterns in the sky, the planets and stars to find influences on people? Some people think astrology is complete rubbish, including myself, but there's still something fascinating about it regardless. Who knows if the effects described in astrological books have any significance at all? However, the creative ingenuity of astrology has proven to inspire many. Over 100 years ago, on a Spanish beach, several not so Spanish men were relaxing, talking about numerous things. One of those topics, who would have guessed, was astrology. These men were of the creative type, an author, two composers, and a rich guy. So such an in-depth and interesting topic was bound to inspire someone to do something. That someone was Gustav Holst, one of the composers. He was a relatively shy man, but passionate like all other composers. And he liked to go his own way when writing music. Relatively different from the neo-romantic and modern composers of his day. In this instance, he turned the interest in astrology into an obsession. But Holst had other interests during this time, mainly in music, of course. The composition he was most obsessed with at this time was Arnold Schoenberg's 5 Pieces for Orchestra, a set of crazy atonal works with impeccable and precise orchestration. He even bought a manuscript of the score so he could study the composition as closely as possible. These two interests, astrology and 5 Pieces for Orchestra, were to be the strongest influences on Holst's upcoming masterpiece. His most well-known work, an orchestral suite of grandiose proportions containing epic themes, tasteful orchestration, and inventive harmony. The Planets, 7 tone poems, each unique in mood, color, and composition, all equally revolutionary and fascinating. This video will begin with a movement-by-movement analysis, going over the individual details of each section of each movement. The choices in harmony, thematic development, orchestration, etc. will be mentioned in detail. Rehearsal markings of notable moments will also be included for reference if you have your own score on you, although I will be showing sheet music on the screen as well, so no pressure. If I were to pour over each and every tiny detail of each bar, you and I would be here for literal days. For the sake of this video taking a reasonable amount of time to produce, I will limit my explanation of more straightforward or obvious elements and how they work. However, feel free to study the score yourself after seeing this video. In fact, I highly recommend it. No matter how long this video is, I will not be able to tell you everything you need to know to get the most out of this piece for your musical education. After the movement-by-movement analysis, I will take a look at the bigger picture, mainly the structures of each piece and how they relate to each other as one continuous unit. The overarching structure and similarities between each movement in the planets could be a whole video unto itself, but I will do my best to give you a good rundown. And yes, Holst's outside influences at that time, which go beyond the 2 mentioned earlier, will be discussed as well in relation to the planets. And to end off this very long video, I will tell you about the cultural and musical influence this piece exerted on the world. Without further ado, it's time to begin. Five-4, Col Legno, G. What I just said was not gibberish, but rather the opening to Mars, the bringer of war. The time signature for the majority of this movement is 5-4. The opening consists of Col Legno strings playing their lowest G, accompanied by harp, timpani with wooden mallets, and a gong, which is adding texture. These instruments carry a singular, repeated ostinato that will be present in some form throughout the rest of the movement. The main melody first comes in through the bassoons and low horns. It is an incredibly raw and ominous sound, both because of the instrumentation, but also the intervals that make up the melody. Up a fifth, down half a step, creating a tritone gap between the melody and ostinato. The melody repeats itself, reaching higher and higher. Some neat orchestration is present here, as the oboes take the place of bassoons almost seamlessly before the clarinets join in to add harmony to a D-flat chord just before figure 1. The head of that chord is a singular muted trumpet, which adds a crude warlike texture to the chord. Also, keep in mind that throughout these passages, the string, timpani, and so on are still playing the G ostinato. This makes the D-flat chord sound less heroic and more disturbing. The trombones take the melody now, varying it up and building in a similar way to how the bassoons traded with the oboes. This time, the trombones trade off to the trumpets, who then seamlessly transition to the horns, which play another variation of the melody, now more clearly and directly harmonized. That leads into a more fully orchestrated set of chords, D flat to B. Please note how the use of a single violin section at the top of this harmonic movement is actually enough to color the entire chord with a string sound, despite the rest of the strings hitting the G ostinato beneath it all. Shows how a little bit of strings can go a long way to keep everything sounding orchestral. These chords keep repeating until eventually the focal point is taken by a call and response by the tenor tuba and trumpets. This call and response echoes the D flat to B chord transitions from before, but now it's the tenor tuba playing broken G octaves and the trumpets harmonizing a broken B major chord. Over time, more instruments take over this call and response until the entire orchestra gets called in and we lead into figure 2. Figure 2 is the first of many triple forte passages in not only the planets as a whole, but Mars in general. A D-flat major chord with the top half of the orchestra stands upon the ostinato, now in C, being played by basically everyone else. This is such a potent sound, it is difficult to fully describe. The screeching of the piccolos all the way down to the thrumming of the double basses is truly an experience to the ears. After 3 bars of that, we are introduced to a new melody, for the first time in the trombones. It is a very chromatic melody, harmonized with parallel major chords. That technique has been imitated by many these days. This new ferocious line is carried by the horns and trumpets next, as the ostinato in C is kept strong through the strings, trumpets, and timpani. Also, note how the violins are actually playing rather low instead of on their G string like before. This helps add more character to this passage, as the previous sections of Mars had the ostinato lower in the orchestra. Some more thematic material is introduced, now much higher in the orchestra, through the violins and flutes. This new line here is mainly meant to contrast and add some counterpoint to the very simple melody of this section. Eventually, things build up so much with the whole orchestra that it has no choice but to collapse into a beautifully dissonant chord, leading to figure 4. Despite that final chord being extremely dissonant and brief, Holst still took the time to perfectly balance it. Good man. The first real solo of Mars is performed by the tenor tuba player, and the solo plays over double stop string chords that remind me of the Rite of Spring. The solo itself is a very barbaric, stupid sounding theme that is echoed in the trumpets. And by stupid, I don't mean it sounds bad, it just sounds incredibly blunt, dull, and simple-minded, like many of those that start wars. The solo theme is then developed in other parts of the orchestra, mainly in the flutes, clarinets, horns, and violins. For the first time, we begin to hear the glory of war, even if just briefly, as a beautiful run leads us to some dramatic harmony and melodic figures. As I said, this is only for a few brief moments, as things crash down into a military-like march with limited instrumentation. Those instruments are trumpets, the tenor tuba, snare drum, and a suspended cymbal, mimicking a military brass band. No strings are present. This is a very stripped-down version of the original tenor tuba solo, with the trumpet response now overpowering the soloist in most recordings. Things build up once more into many chaotic woodwinds and string runs, with the previous mentioned band-like instruments playing underneath, which trade off with horns and bass trombone. These runs build up to a high point, spearheaded by the shrill piccolos. The lower members of the orchestra absolutely destroy it with a muddy A minor over G sharp chord. Note how the trombones are used carefully in this passage, especially the bass trombone, with significantly softer dynamics than the other instruments. It is always wise to be careful when using heavy brass. In Figure 6, the old chromatic trombone melody from earlier is brought back, but in a completely different context. It is now being played by the bassoons and low strings. Their accompaniment is tremolo violins and a snare drum softly beating out an altered version of the ostinato. Also, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but we're now in 5/2. The purpose of this is to give the illusion that time has slowed down, but let the players read the same note lengths. A variation of cut time, you could say. The next, continuously building version of this idea is expanded by the oboe family and violins. The violas and timpani now hold the tremolo from the violins. The snare drum is accompanied by a trumpet and tenor trombone playing an unsettling note on the fragmented ostinato. A crescendo is marked 2 bars into this, allowing everything to build up significantly before going down to piano in the next development of this idea. And now, in figure 7, we introduce some spooky parallel harmony, being carried by the oboes, clarinets, bassoons, strings, and later, the horns. As things continue building up, another full orchestra crescendo is taking place. However, this one does not get interrupted and is allowed to carry to the dynamic on the next page, which you will find out soon. Finally, the parallel harmony is broken, giving rise to these beautifully dissonant chords that just rise and rise. The octaves of trombones, trumpets, oboes, and flutes is extremely potent. Really helps solidify as the incredible build-up it is. Now with the entire orchestra on G, the ostinato is at its most powerful. Despite everyone playing a merciless triple forte, Holst manages to balance this quite well, and it obviously comes off as extremely powerful, to say the least. When the old melody from the start of the piece does come back, the first G hits like a hammer. It is played by lower woodwinds, horns, trombones, tubas, and the entire string section. This passage continues similarly to how it was at the start of the piece, except now certain bars are omitted to keep the pacing quick. This is clear when the trombone part of the melody comes back in. It sounds particularly potent as it interrupts the end of the D flat over G chord. And also, triple forte trombones are nothing to laugh at. The horns build up the more harmonized part of the melody again until things come crashing down into figure 8. The trombones give us a version of the tenor tuba melody from before. Note, 3 trombones at a powerful dynamic like triple forte can absolutely dominate everything else playing here, including the percussion. After this point, the rest of the piece is basically just recapping what we already heard earlier, but with a few important changes. A much more violent and interlocked back and forth between the tenor tuba and trumpet. This back and forth is interrupted by the chromatic trombone melody before coming back for another bar, only for the chromatic melody to return again. The higher register flute and string counterline from before has exactly the same notes, but that's exactly why it sounds different. Instead of those notes being over the ostinato in C, they are over the ostinato in G. A slight difference, but it certainly changes the context of the counterline, making it sound just as intense but fresher. A final build-up at figure 10 then leads us into the great finale of Mars, the Bringer of War, which is in 2 parts. The first part involves these absolutely massive and devastating chords, first in the whole orchestra, then in the strings and woodwinds, then in the horns, and finally in the low brass. These chords are difficult to describe or name, as they seem to be describing a pure emotional feeling rather than provide any traditional harmonic value. From what I can say, these are vaguely Lydian chords, which resolve back to the major chord. Keep note of this type of chord, as we will see other devastating massive 2D chords like this throughout the planets. After that, many flurries of woodwinds and strings bring us into the second part of Mars's finale. Take that original Lydian chord over C and have the brass smash it out over and over. Also note how even though only the brass and later the strings are playing, it sounds like the woodwinds are joining in too. This is because the woodwinds led up to the first note of these chords. Holst doesn't actually need them to destroy their chops too, so he lets the brass overtones and the listener's ear do the rest, filling in the upper frequencies with a vague woodwind sound. The rhythms being played here may seem like random gibberish, but they are vaguely based on the opening ostinato of the piece. It is almost like Mars, in one last rage, is trying to remember who he is. Finally, the movement falls onto a C power chord. Mars, the bringer of war, is a perfect way to open up the suite. An ominous introduction, followed by minutes of battle-worthy marches and ugly harmonies, is just really awesome. This movement also seems to be representing a certain type of person, or perhaps a very human part of all of us, an unbridled rage backed up by an uncontrollable and glorious ego that can eat us from the inside and harm others. The inevitable fate of an uncontrollable rage is devastating collapse, as seen with the brutal ending this movement has. So that was Mars, the bringer of war. Before we begin this section of the analysis in earnest, I want to point out an important difference between Venus, the bringer of peace, and the last movement. And no, that is not the title, mood, or anything of the such, but rather the orchestra itself. Holst does something neat in the Planet Suite, where each movement gets its own unique orchestra, which is a part of the greater orchestra. Mars got basically the entire orchestra. Venus has a stripped down but still massive ensemble. We have quadruple woodwinds, 6 French horns, no heavy brass, notably, glockenspiel and celesta, 2 harps, and strings, of course. Also, note in the woodwind section how we see 4 regular old flutes. These 4 flutes are going to be creating some amazing harmonies. Let's get into the analysis. A soft upper register horn solo begins Venus. The horn then plays the same passage, now joined by flutes and oboes and these overarching chords who telescope into each other, creating a wonderful effect. Also, note the orchestration of extended chords, which are often difficult to get right in an ensemble like this. Holst simply puts flutes on top of oboes and combines them together over time, with the oboes holding the lost sounding chord at the end. We repeat this passage down a minor third with a few other changes before it leads us into the real good stuff of this movement. And that good stuff involves these soft, tenuto, swaying chords in the flutes, horns, and harps. Oboes and glockenspiel take over the melodic role before passing it to the flutes and celesta. The clarinets help this section build up before everyone other than the flutes and clarinets begins to drop out, creating a diminuendo-like effect. We return to the original horn solo with similar accompaniment, but this time the clarinets hold a more hopeful chord, and the violins and cellos begin to push us into a different key from the top and bottom registers of the orchestra. Eventually, we are pushed into this beautiful mezzo forte B major chord that fades into something even more wonderful and delicate. A solo violinist plays one of the most graceful and romantic melodies you will ever hear, while being accompanied by oboes and English horn on the offbeats. This melody is then taken up by all the violins in both sections, with horns playing the soft offbeat chords. This is an incredibly delicate section of music for the conductor and orchestra, as the horns can easily push things overboard, but we are still playing piano dynamics, and therefore no significant force should be present. At figure 2, the violins split into octaves as more of the oboes and clarinets take the place of the horns for accompaniment. Now the orchestra can begin using some force. The mezzo forte is short-lived, however, as the violins passed the melody to the first oboe, leading us back to that intimate feeling from the violin solo, but with a much different color and with flutes accompanying now. The oboe trails off, leading us back to the octave violins, making a powerful statement that begins to get overwhelmed by its own melancholy before the listener is thrust into a pained, yet still elegant sounding chord. Now a bit slower, the violin soloist comes back, but with a sparser, less rhythmically exciting accompaniment in the flutes. This leads us back to our original 3-flat key signature, beginning with a beautiful oboe solo. After that is a similar clarinet solo, with cellos leading us back to a variation of the original oboe solo. When I first heard this part of Venus, I simply believed that the violins were coming back with this line right here. And I believed that for a long time until I actually looked at the score. Turns out it was the violas, and playing in their upper register too, of course. Normally, upper register violas have an almost strained but very intimate sound. My simpleton brain simply could not comprehend this and believe them to be violins. So please listen to the viola's unique upper register sound here. These violas are used to build into a far more powerful passage. This passage takes the original oboe solo melody and puts it across all 4 flutes and the strings, excluding double basses in varying octaves. This melody is harmonized by oboes and English horn, clarinets and bass clarinet, bassoons and double basses, with the contrabassoon and horns coming in when the melody reaches its final note. From this, a solo cello repeats this melodic line one last time before we begin to recap the swaying section from the start of the piece. Like Mars, after the main climactic point of the movement, the rest is mostly recap, taking original material and developing it in unique ways both through the melodies and harmonies, but also the orchestration. This is present in the section of recap, as the horns have a much more prominent role than before, taking the melodic fragment originally played by the oboes and glockenspiel. The flutes do essentially nothing at first here, which is a stark contrast from their original and important harmonic role earlier. Although the flutes do build in towards the end of this passage and hold the final chord, just like old times. The same original horn solo comes back, but instead of the horn repeating its own statement, the first flute takes that role instead. So if the flute is taking the solo line, who is going to harmonize it if not the flutes or oboes? Well, my friend, Holst decides to split each violin section into 4 individual desks, 2 players per desk, creating a beautiful effect that, although considered overused throughout the 20th century, which was Holst's time, it works perfectly and beautifully here. A driving solo cello line pushes us into a large chord once more. Now it is an E major 9 chord rather than a B major chord. Either way, it is orchestrated beautifully and leads to the violin solo from before, now being played by all the firsts, and with even sparser accompaniment. Only the flutes give occasional offbeat chords where the melody line is more static. From there, a solo horn and its bassoon accompaniment begin the transition to the coda. Trust me, it is going to happen and it will be beautiful. The strings lead us into flutes, clarinets, and bass clarinet doing the telescope chord idea, but now it sounds so much happier and filled with love instead of desolate and depressed. The harp and celesta lead us back into the swaying idea from earlier, sounding more hopeful again. However, this time, things begin to get much darker, and we are hit with one last surge of melancholy, followed by the coda. In most classical music, the coda is generally a quite separate sounding part of the piece, placed at the end to give some last variety and perhaps alter the overall mood and perception of the piece a little bit. Venus is no different. Compared to the rest of the movement, the coda finally sounds at ease and happy. 16th note figures emphasize this, emphasizing the harmony and greeting this happy feel-good sensation. The celesta carries this line super well, sounding delicate and sweet. The old swaying motion from earlier comes back in the horns, with some offbeat syncopation in the celesta, playing those same chords many octaves higher, with the flutes taking those lovely 16th note figures from earlier. The last few bars of Venus are met with a peaceful, content feeling, with swaying flutes, divisi violins, and harp. Finally, the movement ends with one last sweet celesta line and fading second violins. In my opinion, this movement represents coming to terms with tragedy. After the ending of Mars, the bringer of war, the listener's ears are thoroughly shot, and their emotions quite startled. At first, it seems this second movement is trying to soothe us, but it appears to be struggling itself, as seen with some of the dissonant, almost devastating chords, and the overall desolate yet beautiful feeling. Over time, things begin to get more hopeful. Even if the overall orchestration in the recap section is more delicate in certain places, it does not sound as desolate. The last third of Venus is coming to terms with loss and feeling warm nonetheless. This is not the only movement in the suite to end with the feeling of letting go. Another planet in particular does this in a much more mature but not necessarily better or worse way. Venus accomplishes what it needed to do, being the modest and delicate bringer of peace. The orchestra changes once more. Let me give you the rundown. 2 piccolos, 2 flutes, 2 oboes, English horn, bass oboe, 3 bassoons, contrabassoon. Those are the woodwinds. Brass is 4 horns, 2 trumpets, and that's it for brass. No trombones or tubas are present here. Next, we have some percussion, notably celesta and timpani, and of course, strings. That's what Holst is working with for Mercury, the winged messenger. We begin with muted strings carrying this unique thematic run idea with oboe family instruments, harps, and basses supporting. After reaching a peak with flutes, the rhythm is varied with quadruplet tetrachords, speeding things up into downwards runs once more. This brings us to the piccolo's first time in the spotlight, playing to similar figures as to what is seen before. And by the time we get to figure 1, the first pieces of thematic material have been well introduced to the listeners. Before I continue, I would like to mention something extremely important about this piece, which I will surely talk about again. Bitonality. Mercury uses two key signatures at the same time. Notice the B flat major scale and E major scale coexisting? Yep, that's one of the main reasons things sound as awesome as they do. Bitonality. B major going up, E major going down. Figure 1 introduces a much more aggressive staccato theme being played by middle winds and harp. This motif is repeated until we are brought back to the chaotic runs from earlier. From here, another piece of thematic material is introduced. This time, it is far more melodic, much less chaotic and chromatic. First, it starts in fragments. The firsts pulse a harmonic note above, resembling Morse code. In figure 2, the new melody gets more developed. This new motif is the closest thing we have to resembling a full-on melody, and it sounds quite playful, not being afraid to leave the scale in important places. It is also not afraid to project quite a bit of force, but after several variations of this motif, it eventually dies down, leading to another motif. Mercury, being as quick as it is, has to get its main points across rather efficiently, and Holst does this quite well. This new melody is first played by a solo violin, which is then passed to the first oboist, then the first flute, then the celesta. You get the point. These first few iterations of this melody are quite soft and intimate with a soloist, but that does not take away from the deep harmony that produces a sense of wonder in the listener. Eventually, things begin to build up noticeably at figure 4, with all the violins playing the melody, working with the winds and horns playing beautiful chords beneath. This finally explodes into a beautiful tutti, first with violins, flutes, and clarinets on the melody, then the dynamics change over to fortissimo, with the trumpets commanding the melody. The melody begins to shrink as instruments leave the original tutti. One thing of note here is that the violins are instructed to play on the G string exclusively for this passage. This was done intentionally so that the violins could blend with the cellos, violas, and especially the horns. All violins have 4 decently distinct sounding strings, with the lowest one, the G string, being the thickest, richest, and heaviest sounding one. This is why Holst chose to add the marking Sol G, to tell the players to exclusively use their G string here. Things slow down even more until we eventually reach a fermata, with the flutes, clarinets, bass clarinet, bassoons, and contrabassoon outlining a devastation chord similar to the one at the end of Mars. This chord is much softer here, however. This Lydian chord comes up several more times in various forms throughout the planets, as it seems to be a Holst favorite. The English horn and bass oboe try to pick things up again, only to be interrupted by the same dark chord now in the strings. In figure 6, we get a sort of recap of the beginning, but the emotional overtones set earlier make it seem less innocent than the first time. Things remain largely the same, excluding a few sped up passages until figure 7. Where we get into the real good stuff of this movement, even more bitonality. Bitonality has existed throughout many earlier parts of this movement, including the previous mentioned recap section. Mainly those quick arpeggios alternating between B flat major and E major, which is what gives the movement its whimsical grace in the first place. But now bitonality is being thrown directly in our face with great contrast between different keys. This is mainly present through the woodwinds clashing with the strings. This is not quite bitonality as we saw it before, however. The two keys aren't overlapping in any major way, but they do trade off in quick succession, creating a key center that is completely in the air. This section also strays from atonality, as when it is in a scale, even if only briefly, it sticks to the scale quite closely, unless it is transitioning to another key. Quick quadruplet runs, often tetrachords, facilitate those sudden key switches. This section is repeated, then brought to a climactic peak before leading up into the next section in B major. Timpani strikes bring back the rhythmic motif from one of the earlier parts of the piece, as the old bouncing celesta motif returns with answers in woodwinds. This last section of the piece is a wonderful combination of all the previous ideas into a nice little package, with even the solo violin melody making a dignified return. By figure 10, much of the original energy from the end of the very bitonal section has dissipated. This leaves some bitonal runs over the double basses providing a pedal, until things rise up once more in quadruplets, leading to a reverse situation from before, with the bouncing motif below a very high violin harmonic, until we end on a gentle and brief chord. Mercury, the winged messenger, was the last of the movements Holst composed. Because of this, the movement aligns very closely in character to its astrological significance. Many of the other movements, notably Saturn and Mars, had ideas associated with them before Holst became enthralled completely by astrology, and let it influence everything he wrote in the suite. But Mercury is pure, unadulterated Mercury. It conveys a very pure type of mood, and is perhaps the most one-dimensional and straightforward in this aspect compared to all the other movements. We saw Mars having a glorious side to it, even if only brief moments, while Venus had great moments of strife, even if they were far and few between. Also, I can't help to mention the bitonality of this movement. It's one of the reasons I really like this movement. It is not trying to be a grand journey or some sort of emotional epiphany, but a fun scherzo with some cool harmonic techniques and a well-utilized and massive woodwind section. We return to a massive orchestra again, far larger than the ensemble required for Mercury. 2 piccolos, 2 flutes, 3 oboes, English horn, 3 clarinets in B flat, bass clarinet, 3 bassoons, and contrabassoon. 6 horns split into 3 groups of 2, 4 trumpets, 2 tenor trombones, bass trombone, tenor tuba in B flat, and bass tuba. For percussion, we have 6 timpani and quite a bit of other percussion: triangle, tambourine, cymbals, bass drum, and glockenspiel. Finally, we have 2 harps and strings. Let's get started. Jupiter is one of those pieces where the core motif, the few notes that drive and connect the entire thing and get developed into many different powerful directions, are at the very beginning. In this case, we hear the second violins play E, G, A, very quickly ascending and staccato. This minor third, then major second figure is the main motif of Jupiter, the bringer of jollity. Let's see how it's developed in this introduction. The first violins take over a similar pattern, A, C, D, that runs on top of the original pattern, but off in terms of rhythm. The time signature is 2-4, but these motives are only 3/16 notes long, which is what creates this offbeat feel to it. When things begin to separate into even more parts, it sounds like just a huge wall of excited violins. The first instance of melody plays over the violin texture, carried by all 6 French horns, violas, and cellos. It is a grand statement. This is then followed by an orchestral hit. Not like one of those crappy synthesized ones on a keyboard. Those are not representative of an actual orchestral hit, but an actual, legitimate, not faking it, orchestral hit played by all the woodwinds, 3rd and 4th trumpet, all the trombones, bass tuba, both timpani players, and the double basses at the very bottom. After that orchestral hit, all the strings, excluding the double basses, begin to take over the textural motives in the background, with the 1st and 2nd trumpets gradually crescendoing into the next instance of the first melody. The horns sit it out this time, allowing the lower woodwinds and brass to do all of the work. The melody builds as it did before, but now instead of an orchestral hit, we get an orchestral smash. Instead of a boring old C major chord like last time, we get a truly excited E major chord. A triangle roll really helps with the excitement factor too. After the excitement of the tutti chord, we are greeted with an equally excited tutti melody, beautifully harmonized and orchestrated. For some reason, this melody reminds me of sitcom themes, but don't ask me why. This is immediately followed by tremolo strings with 4 French horns answering with a neat upward fourths figure. We once again hear a repeat of the sitcom theme, this time scaled down to strings that blend perfectly with clarinets and bassoons. The lead trumpet takes the upward fourth melody, with tremolo strings shimmering behind it. The upper winds play a version of the upward fourth melody, now in a more frantic harmonic context. Also, note here how it takes many woodwinds playing that double forte to match only a single trumpet at just forte. That proves the power of the heavy brass and how they have dominance over basically everyone else if they wanted to blast. At figure 2, we get the main motif of this piece again, this time leading into triumphant chords followed by the 16th version of the main motif in flutes and piccolos, accompanied by the upward fourth theme and various instruments below them. The main theme followed by the chord patterns is once again put into place, now followed by a build-up to the next section with the flutes and piccolo providing texture above, with the trumpets playing the upward fourth motif, with a ritenuto bringing things to be slower. Who would have guessed? The main motif is developed again, now into a full-on melody carried by all 6 horns and all the strings excluding double basses. I should really make a short form for all the strings excluding double basses. This is a very common technique used in this piece for the melody. This new joyous and very much in-your-face melody is accompanied by a marching pattern from the tuba and trombones. The woodwinds then take up the melody, with the marching pattern going to a soft trombone and lower strings and gentle trumpets. The glockenspiel is doubling certain notes of the melody, but not all of them, as that would likely annoy the listener and pollute the overall noise of everyone else who is playing. Poor glockenspiel. Overall, this gives a very much Christmas shopping music effect. Very nice. After that, we hear a softer version of the first melody of the piece, now played by strings. The flutes and piccolos take the attention away with a textural motif that they really like to play now. The oboes, bass clarinet, and bassoons take the melody now, which leads into these blocky upper wind chords, with the trumpet playing the upward fourth motif. This is all a build-up to the next section of the piece, which is going to introduce a very enjoyable melody. Once again, we have all 6 horns on a melody, but this melody is quite unique. It is unique because we are now in 3/4 time, and the melody reflects that in a fun and bouncy way. Accompanying the horns are the strings playing strong double and triple stopped, maybe even quadruple stopped chords, providing harmony and a very solid downbeat. The next iteration of the melody gives the strings and the non-flute winds the melody. The horns now supply the harmony in a very unique way, coming in on the second beat before doing arpeggios on the next bar. This gives the chords an almost spontaneous feel, which is offsetted by the stable downbeats provided by the timpani and basses. The third iteration gives the melody to trumpets and octaves. The stop string chords come back, but a lot more exciting stuff is happening. The upper winds are playing these neat arpeggio figures, 8th notes going down, 16ths going up. This helps give every other bar so much more momentum, although halfway through the woodwinds decide to stay active all the way through with these more triplet-based figures. In the bars that the woodwinds don't hit, the horns are there to supply these neat syncopated chords to keep the momentum going before going to their good old-fashioned arpeggios. Speaking of momentum, the first instance of non-pitched percussion is used in this figure here for this specific melody, being through the tambourine. It at first helps emphasize the on beats before only rolling on beats 2 and 3, leaving the listener in suspense for what will happen next. At figure 6, we are given the fourth iteration of the melody, where things start to get even more interesting. The violins, violas, and cellos are now playing in complete unison, with the violins instructed to play on the G string. This is like Mercury, as it helps them blend with the sound of, in this case, the tenor tuba, also playing the melody now, which has a rough yet dulled sound, mainly there to provide extra strength and support. The bass line has switched things up, playing the same overall notes, just in a cooler rhythm. An old motif is brought back here, that being the upwards fourth line, which is seen first in the first trumpet before the upper winds take it and turn it into a beautiful texture. I forgot to mention that stringendo is marked at the start of the section, which takes things a little faster now. In the next version of this melody, things have officially reached fortissimo, which significantly pushes the power of the melody. All 4 trumpets are on the melody now, in 2 octaves of course. A page like this looks very complicated, but there are a few key roles going on here, so let's tackle those. We already talked about who's playing the melody, so who's on the bass line? Well, we got lower strings, all bassoons, and bass clarinet. With the chords, we got horns and violas. The upper winds are still playing the same upward fourth motif as before, but now they are joined by glockenspiel and violins. This seems quite thorough, but there's still one function left here, and that is a brand new counter melody. It is played by 2 forte trombones and does a fantastic job to contrast and support the original melody without getting in the way of everything. The 6th and final iteration of this melody is extremely different from how we started. Now the counter melody is at the front, being played by horns and trumpets, with the original melody on the trombones, violas, and cellos, and the timpani. The upward fourth melody is still here, now joined by the 3rd and 4th trumpets. As things get excessively faster, it becomes harder to distinguish the different parts until this entire figure is basically just a huge orchestral explosion that slowly fades out. It begins as a forte fortissimo tutti chord across the orchestra's entire register. The horns then join in directly, leading to the heavy brass hitting this ADHD rhythm with all their strength. The chord switches once again, now with both timpani players providing a rhythm countering the chord. This then diminuendos into our final chord, which is a C minor chord, setting the seeds for the 3 flat key signature coming up. The violins and cellos pluck a very quick 16th pedal leading into figure 8. If you try tapping your first left finger, then your first right finger, second left finger, then second right finger, you will mimic the plucking technique used here. I hope I was in time there to prove the point, but you should try that right now because it's fun. This part of Jupiter is basically the only time where things stay quite soft, with the woodwinds and pizzicato strings gently but urgently playing these motives reminiscent of previous sections of the piece, and foreshadowing what is to come. Finally, the flutes and piccolos take things to the section's highest point before a final soft timpani roll and chord in the clarinets, bassoons, and pluck strings lead us into the next section. Six French horns, violins, violas, and cellos introduce us to the final development of the original motif of Jupiter. The age-old melody begins with the minor third, then major second step-ups, the original motif, which leads into a carefully crafted, a perfect tune that has left a legacy lasting generations. More on that later. Playing the chords and bass are all of the clarinets, all the bassoons, both harps in unison, which will stay that way for the rest of this passage, and pizzicato double basses. This orchestration is continued until the last quarter of the melody, where some interesting things happen. First of all, the horns drop out of the melody and take on a more harmonic counterpoint role, which sounds absolutely gorgeous. Second of all, in order to compensate for all six horns leaving the melody, a single trumpet and three clarinets, with that singular trumpet instructed to play solo, takes their place, lending some much needed strength to the unison strings. The second iteration of this melody has the strings now split in octaves, as pushing the violas or cellos any further up would be unwise. Horns take the chords now in a beautiful chordal chorale. The bass line has been strengthened with the remaining bassoons, and the lead trumpet is playing this wonderful conflicted counterline almost to the main melody, which is in the strings and clarinets. At figure 9, things go to forte, and the melody raises another octave, now with the flutes and oboes contributing. Because the melody is getting higher and higher, more instruments have a chance to thrive in the lower registers, like the bass trombone and timpani. The trumpets take over the chords, and soon enough things begin building up to perhaps the most beautiful climax in the planets. The melody is being held by upper woodwinds, all six horns, and the strings, now split into 3 octaves. The chords are played triumphantly by the trumpets and trombones. Harps are negligible at this point. And the bass line is carried by the bass clarinet, all the bassoons, bass trombone and tuba, timpani, and double basses. Altogether, this creates a truly huge and beautiful orchestral climax with a perfect melody, moving harmony, and an emotional peak that just sort of leaves itself on a suspended 4 chord. flat sus4 chord is continued in the tremolo violins, mark 2 desks for extra delicacy. From here, the rising fourth motif return in the woodwinds, and climbs from the English horn to the clarinet to the oboe, then finally flutes and piccolos. After things drop again and the bassoons take the motif, the key signature of 3 flats now becomes redundant, and we are able to go back to our C major centered key from before. Under the gaze of tremolo strings, the first oboe plays the first melody of the piece, before being joined by piccolo 2 octaves above. From here, the motif turns into the fluttering texture 1, as the first trumpet leads us into the first forte fortissimo chord since before the middle section. This chord is quite shallow compared to many of its counterparts, however, as we only get horns and trumpets, with most of the other instruments playing the textural motif. However, one cool thing, and that is the triangle and crash cymbal are helping strengthen the chord, especially from a percussion standpoint. The remaining instruments suddenly join us again, playing the first melody with such amazing force you forget all about what has happened before. This leads into an extended build-up, which is followed by the good old E major chord, but now starting at piano and crescendoing to fortissimo. This is a great way to delay gratification for the listener because it is unexpected yet totally satisfying. After this, we get the expected triumphant tutti section that we heard before. Everything past this point is basically recap, so let me point out the main changes. Everything is very much the same with only a few small tweaks, mainly in the key centers. That is, until figure 15, the reintroduction of the 3/4 dance theme, where things get very different. We are now temporarily in D flat major, with the upper winds and glockenspiel carrying the melody with pizzicato strings providing the chords. The second iteration modulates half a step down directly to C major, with horns taking the melody, accompanied by woodwind runs, tambourine, and arco strings. The third iteration builds things up even more, having the strings take the melody with the trumpet reintroducing the rising fourths motif. From here, things once again explode into fortissimo, with octave trumpets carrying the melody and both tenor trombones playing the counterline. Once more, the counterline comes into full force. It seems we are headed back to a grand chord once more, but Holst takes a different approach. section melody returns, now played by low instruments, with the violins and upper winds providing conflicted arpeggios. The trumpets prematurely take the theme, allowing for a chromatic sweep into the grand finale of Jupiter. The grand finale, aka the coda, involves the upward fourth motif playing above a hard trumpet pad, which leads into a last chordal melodic figure, then a big bang of a C major orchestral hit. To conclude the analysis of this movement, Jupiter, the bringer of Jollity, is an extremely joyous yet mature piece of music. It reflects many states of happiness, excitement, joy, optimism, contentment, and love. The love of the middle section is perhaps the strongest of all. All of these moods are reflected with incredibly mature and thought-through orchestration that seamlessly blends with the other parts of the composition. Overall, Jupiter was an extremely uplifting and well-made piece of music. However, what is coming next is about to crush those spirits. The orchestra has shrunken slightly since Jupiter, but the piece will still be quite massive in scope. 3 flutes, alto flute in G, 2 oboes, English horn, bass oboe, 3 clarinets in B flat, bass clarinet, 3 bassoons, contrabassoon. Brass has 6 horns in 2 groups of 3, 4 trumpets, 2 tenor trombones, bass trombone, bass tuba, and there is no tenor tuba here. Percussion is timpani and notably bells, not glockenspiel, but rather tubular bells, like chimes. Finally, we have organ pedal, 2 harps, and strings to complete the orchestra. Saturn begins with one of the most desolate passages in the suite. 2 flutes, an alto flute, and both harps in harmonics play this oscillating figure made up of tritones. Unlike Venus's oscillating pattern, which felt more like a sad dance almost, Saturn's pattern reminds the listener of a clock, a grandfather clock, in the middle of the night, ticking away, regardless if anyone cares to watch it or not. From the darkness, the double basses come in, with the main melodic figure of Saturn. This figure also involves the use of the tritone, but the most recognizable aspect of it is the rhythm. Without using exact note lengths, for reasons you will find out later, we have one really long note, followed by a medium length note, then a short note, then another medium length, then a really long note again. I just realized this, and that is actually quite symmetrical, although in variations of this melody to come, it won't be perfectly symmetrical. The melody is repeated again, now with the double basses and octaves. This creates a distinct sound different from double basses and cellos, as basses have a much more rugged sound, and the upper octave will sound more nasal and strained this way. This then dovetails into the violins and violas, which extend the last half of the melody, pushing it all the way to forte before dying down again. I cannot understate how powerful this sounds, with dozens of string players on the same few notes, creating an incredibly full sound that contrasts the desolate feeling of everything around it. Yet at the same time, this reinforces that empty feeling due to how the line interacts with the harmonies. After this, islands of melody come from various instruments in the orchestra. First, the oboe, which dovetails into the cellos playing in their upper tenor register sound incredibly strange yet beautiful. Before they finish their phrase, the bass oboe jumps in with another fragment of the main melody, doing a good job at covering up when the cellos actually leave. The bass oboe then dovetails into the first horn, which leads us to figure 1. This section is marked poco animato, which means a little animated. Basically, we're getting slightly faster with a slightly less gloomy mood. The pace is actually going to feel a lot faster here because we have this quarter note march figure in the double basses and cellos playing pizzicato. This is followed by a development of the main melody, now sounding more consonant in the trombones, who play solemnly. There are many interpretations that describe this part of Saturn: a funeral march, the commute to another day of a soul-crushing job, or a holy procession of some kind. Either way, the trombones give a very serious effect. After the trumpets take over the melody briefly, the motif begins to be developed more and more. Basically, the entire orchestra begins to wrap around each other, with the motif growing taller and taller. First it sounds triumphant, but a change in harmony turns this passage into more of an existential crisis. The counterpoint is then dropped, leading to several emotionally stirring chords that shrink into this little tuba figure accompanied by the trombones, which perfectly transitions us to the next section in figure 2. Here, the key center of C is stabilized with the trombones, while the timpani and harp begin an offbeat quarter note rhythm, which will become important very soon. The trombones are immediately followed by the horns and winds suddenly at forte, before they all die down. Now all three flutes and alto flute take over, playing some neat chords roughly in the key center of C minor. These chords are accompanied by the timpani, harps, and double basses from below on the offbeat, which either adds to the chord, reinforces it, or conflicts with it. The combination of the creepy yet fascinating chords and consistent offbeats gives this section the feeling of a clock once more, a theme of time that has been persistent through the piece. After the initial wave of flute chords, things build up into an E major chord consisting of most of the woodwinds before it comes crashing down on C minor again, now all in forte. All of these instruments together sound almost like an organ, and that only reinforces the inevitability of whatever we are heading to. The accompaniment initially became stronger here as well, now with the violas, cellos, and double basses playing arco, with all but the basses playing double stop chords, creating a potent effect. After 4 bars of that awesomeness, the trumpets take over the chords 1 octave below, which by the way is still a pretty good dovetailing due to the trumpet's strong overtones. Some horns are added to the chords to reinforce the trumpets, with more horns progressively being added over time as the trumpets go higher and higher. The accompaniment chords are now joined by tuba and bassoons, followed by bass trombone, then all the trombones plus the violins in their lower to middle register. This all balances out quite well, with the trombones providing massive weight to each hit, with the violins giving a little extra support. From here, things begin to crescendo into the terrifying size as the dynamics reach forte, fortissimo, and the entire brass section is at work. It appears that there is no place to go from here, as how could things possibly die down without it sounding forced? Well, Holst devised a plan in his structure that fixes this problem, and that's our good old friend, recap. Tempo increases and the old oscillating chord motif from the very beginning returns, but now much faster and more powerful. It is played by flutes, all oboe family members, and clarinet members, with the horns providing a strong offbeat to it. The strings are split between the on-beat chords and off-beat chords, helping reinforce their own sound across the board. Also, this is the first time we hear the bells, aka tubular bells or chimes, which sound terrifying in this context. These few bars catch a lot of first-time listeners by surprise, and it is no wonder. They come out of nowhere from an established pattern and surprise you with the old clock motif, which never sounded that pleasant to begin with. We briefly return to the chord and stomp idea, sounding just as huge as before, but now in the context of what just happens, it feels incredibly uncertain, despite everything being identical from before. Are we going to hear the bells again? Yes. The visceral oscillating pattern returns just as it did, but now it's not going away. Many of the orchestra's lowest instruments, the bass clarinet, bassoons, contrabassoon, tuba, cellos, and basses come crashing down on the original motif from the very beginning. If things were bad before, now they just got 10 times more frantic and panicked. The first trumpet alone answers this massive statement by the lower orchestra with a simple development of the main motif, which was first heard in the first oboe many pages ago. Despite being a singular player, in most recordings, the first trumpet is able to stand out in the oppressive and cutting fog that is the oscillating chords. The same motif is played right after by all 4 trumpets in unison now, which if the first trumpet alone wasn't noticeable, all 4 certainly will be. This is all foreshadowing something far greater and much more terrifying. The panic chords suddenly break off, leaving room for the trumpets and trombones to hit the listener with the same fragment, but now harmonized in the most devastating and pained way possible. This huge brass chord is the climax of the entire movement. All the oppressive feelings from earlier, the grandfather clock, the existential harmonies, and so on, all come crashing down on this one moment of pure terror. This harmonized version of the motif is repeated exclusively in the trombones, before dying off in the strings as one last call for help. Now we return to a section very similar to the original section, the very first section of the movement. Oscillating chords now stuck on the offbeat for the most part, accompanied by the occasional dash of melody. First, the bass oboe sounding haunting as always in this movement. Then the violas and cellos playing quite high, repeating the exact same terrifying fragment from before. And finally the bass trombone and tuba in octaves, leading us into the next section. The movement takes a very sharp turn here, after the existential chaos and relieved misery from the previous figures. We are greeted with something quite calming, and that calming texture is muted strings below harp harmonics, playing these beautiful chords all together. Cutting through this texture later on are the double basses, playing a well-developed, more mature-sounding version of the original melody. Note that the time signature is changed to 3-2, and a key center of C-sharp minor has been developed, which changes the notes and exact rhythms of the motif, but the overall contour is clearly recognizable. The double basses reach higher into the register, sounding rather graceful, before falling down into the major 4 chord of the scale. Using that chord, a key change takes place from C-sharp minor to B minor, leading us into the next section. Now the clarinets and bassoons take the melody, developing it a little bit. Holst avoided using a different set of instruments, say trombones here, because this melody is almost exactly the same as the trombone march version from Figure 1. So having trombones play it again would be too texturally similar. The flutes and first harp provide the accompaniment, with quicker chords from earlier increasing the energy. Halfway through this passage, the horns join the melody, giving it more weight and texture, leading us into the major 4 chord of B minor. Suddenly, the entire movement opens up into one of the most beautiful and alluring sections in the planet. The entire string section comes together to play the melody in varying octaves, supported by the organ pedal. But, at least in my opinion, the best part is the multi-layered accompaniment. The uppermost layer is the flutes, doing these runs that wash over the scene Holst has created, giving the listener the feeling of levitation. Below the flutes are all 6 horns playing this oscillating motif. This new motif is not at all meant to be confused with the creepy chords from the start of Saturn. It has a different pattern, and emphasizes different points of the scale. This horn motif is significant because it takes the original idea of oscillating chords and turn it into something that sounds like it is timeless, rather than running out of time. Each group of 2 horns plays this motif slightly differently, allowing beautiful and organic sounding overlaps to take place. Both harps are playing these beautiful 16th note figures that add even more texture to the section, with the bells, now instructed to play with a soft striker, humming and buzzing through it all. Overall, this section has 5 different functions: the melody, and then 4 textural functions, including the flutes doing their own unique function, the horns doing their own unique function, and then also the harps and the bells. This is such a treat to listen to every time. It really never gets old. The trombones gently take the melody from the strings, giving much different overtones to the textural masterpiece above. The trombones pass it off back to the strings, but now playing far higher, the violins soaring into the heavens, with woodwinds and trumpets providing a soft yet urgent harmonic bed. It almost feels like Holst considered changing keys again, but the texture he had created here was just too good to pass off, so he instead decided to develop the melody even more. Just speculation. The previous statement by the strings transitions smoothly into the last unique idea of this movement, two beautiful chords, yet conflicted chords, soaring high into the air. These chords are F major over E, followed by D minor 9. The violins soar back into the textural motives from earlier, now playing the major 6 of the scale, which is firmly in C major now. These chords are then suddenly repeated once more, now with a much more solid, grounded, and deep bass line, making everything sound unbelievably resonant. This releases itself into the last bars of Saturn. The violins play unbelievably high, emphasizing the major 7th of the scale, creating a C major 7 chord. The flutes and harps take over the horns' overlapping motif, now altering it slightly to fit the harmonic context better. With all this playing, the bass gets one last chance to shine as it slowly rises in fifths and fourths, until it is cut off by a horn chord, initially hidden by the last bell stroke. All this leaves only the violins and violas outlining a soft C major 7 chord. Saturn represents the claustrophobic feeling that comes before something you hold dearly is going to end. This could mean many things, perhaps leaving your family to start your own life. It could mean putting down a pet, or even reaching the end of your own life. The first 2/3 of Saturn build into this monstrous fear, this desire to be free and escape from this fear, to not have anything in your life change. But this is ultimately all for nothing. It is only the last third of Saturn that we get the feeling of release and freedom. But even this section is still conflicted with dissonant harmonies, and for all the wisdom it seems to project, the memories of the past, of the worry, are still present. It is only until the last few bars that true freedom is achieved, with the C major 7 chord ending things off peacefully. It's all going to be okay. Uranus the Magician has the exact same orchestra as Jupiter, except we have a bass oboe instead of a third oboe. Furthermore, the timpani is split between 2 players, with the first player getting 4 drums and the second player getting 2 drums. Most of the other movements split it between the 2 players evenly. And last but not least, we have xylophone and of course the very vague percussion. Let's get started with this crazy piece. Uranus the Magician begins differently from the other planets. while the other movements thus far have subtly introduced some of their main motives in the introduction. Even in the case of Jupiter, which hid its main intervals behind a texture, Uranus shoves itself right in your face from the very beginning. That motif is G, E flat, A, B. Played initially here by all the trumpets and trombones in octaves, each note held by a fermata, its length at the conductor's discretion. This is immediately followed by another statement of the motif, now an octave lower, much faster, and played by the two tubas in octaves. Before you have enough time to process the weirdness of that, the timpani jumps out at you with an inverted version of the motif, starting on E flat instead. It sounds extremely raw due to the timpani's natural sound at this extreme dynamic. This is followed by a bar of silence, then the chaos begins. Staccato bassoons begin playing this bouncy, goofy harmony, which the bass oboe then joins, adding its own funny color in this context. From here, more instruments are added, which leads into a crescendo to forte. At figure 1, trumpets and horns dominate the melody, which devolves into more joking rhythms and chords, while the main motif comes back in the tubas. Also, note the excellent and tasteful use of xylophone here, adding just enough playfulness to this passage to make it sound funny and light, but not too childish. From here, the harmony turns into something a bit more contemplative, perhaps even a bit more innocent. This is reinforced by soaring strings and a soft trumpet pad. At figure 2, we get our first fully formed melody, which, as expected, sounds quite goofy. This melody is played by first bassoon and pizzicato cellos, with flutes, piccolos, and second harp accompanying it. The melody then trades off to bass oboe and pizzicato violas, before moving up to first oboe and second violins, who are also pizzicato. The combination of solo woodwinds and pizzicato strings is perfect for the vibe of the movement, being light and agile but not terribly graceful by the beautiful definition. Bassoons and cellos take back the melody, pushing it higher, with soaring violins interrupting the phrases. Next is horn and violas, with the horn being pushed all the way to its high written E flat. This passage is cut short by violins once again. And finally, the clarinets and pizzicato seconds take the melody, with arco firsts an octave above contributing to the melody now instead of cutting it off. After that, the oboe and violas take this melodic figure for the last time, and the idea begins to trail off into these spiraling downward runs that get progressively more insane and multi-layered. The best way to describe this melody is jolly but demented. The horns and strings play on the strong beats mainly, with winds, trumpets, trombones, and double basses on a sort of offbeat, if you can even call it that, in 6/4. This section consists of 3-bar phrases, a lot of weird harmony, and enharmonic equivalents, for various reasons which would take a long time to explain at all. But suffice to say, this all sounds very big and jolly, but kinda scary at the same time. At least Jupiter knew some restraint. Uranus always wants more. Speaking of more, the trumpets grab the melody, trading off with the horns for the second and third bars of each phrase. Many woodwinds are also doubling the melody, giving it more weight. The timpani players have joined in to strengthen the bass line. These strings are split between the violins playing the melody, the violas and cello switching from a melodic roll to a harmonic roll with massive quadruple stops, while the double basses do what they do best, the bass line. Also, a tambourine has joined in here, once again reminding us of Jupiter, as it is used similarly to that movement here, just with more vigor and less restraint. By figure 4, the melody has reached its peak, with the high E flat trading off with a chord below, then a lower E flat, another chord, and finally a held E flat that seems content to just exist. Just kidding, an A power chord crushes all hope, turning that E flat into the flattened fifth of one of Holst's devastation chords. Perhaps Uranus has just suffered some serious damage to his pride. This diminuendos into various statements of the main motif, getting us off of this tangent and back to a more stable development of ideas. First in the bass clarinet, bassoons, and double basses, then the first timpani player alone, followed by the bass tuba player, also completely alone, which leads us into the bassoons again, now trading off with the timpani quite quickly. The bassoons build things back up into a large-scale woodwind run, starting at the piccolos and running down to the clarinets, which is interrupted by trombones, who lead us nicely, or rather quite roughly, into the next section. The very brassy version of the motif from earlier crashes down into a demented march. This march involves a basic 5-1 on the bottom, but a much more elaborate figure on top of it. This figure is, of course, the main motif of Uranus, now played in a cool rhythm and repeated over and over again. The instrumentation of this passage is quite fun, with contrabassoon, harp, second timpani, and lower strings on the bass line, with bass oboe, bass clarinet, bassoons, first timpani, and violas playing the motif section of the march. When things eventually diminuendo down the piano, both tuba players introduce us to a new melody in octaves. This melody is quite light-hearted and goofy as always, but it is still in its least developed and innocent form. The trumpets then take the second phrase of the melody, accompanied by the snare drum outlining the rhythm of the motif. An unexpected yet totally natural sounding 9/8 bar transitions us to the next rendition of this melody. Now in mezzo forte horns, the melody is larger. When it transitions to the upper woodwinds, it gets a bit of a whimsical feel, but that is of course cut short by another 9/8 bar with the motif ending it off. At figure 6, the melody is developed even further, with trumpets playing these staccato fragments over a more boiled down instrumentation of the original march. Oh yeah, can't forget about the tambourine coming back briefly here. Very nice. When the trumpets end their little figure on a held note, the upper winds do their rundown thing again, and it sounds just as cool as always. Speaking of the upper winds, they now take the melody, still in fragments, and the flutes and the piccolos help push it to extreme heights. The horns offer a few staccato notes of their own, which are answered by the timpani, crescendoing the massive motif. Trumpets try something similar to the horns, but instead of being met with the timpani, they are greeted by a tenor tuba solo simply playing the motif. After that, the horns give us one more melodic fragment, then we get to the true build-up. More and more instruments slowly begin to join either the 5-1 or the melodic fragments headed by the winds. That is until the orchestra begins to pile on top of each other into these supermassive chords, going back and forth, slowing down, then launching into the climax of Uranus. I'm not going to waste your time here. Piccolos, flutes, oboes, English horn, clarinets, horns, trumpets, tenor trombones, and violins are on the melody, now harmonized. As for the march, we have bass, oboe, first and second bassoon, tenor tuba, first timpani, xylophone, and violas on the motif, and the third bassoon, contrabassoon, bass trombone, bass tuba, second timpani, and lower strings on the 5-1. That was a lot of explaining. But that is the entire orchestra right there. One of Holst's magnificent tutis. Now that I have explained the orchestration, which hardly changes, all I have to say is that the melody continues on very similarly to how it originated back at figure 5. However, I will explain how this orchestral magnificence ends. Past the second phrase and 9/8 bar, the melody decides to keep going, but less of itself. It is now these sustained notes sitting between versions of the motif. Each time this pattern continues, it gets more aggressive until we end on a massive quadruple forte C major chord. The organ plays a super cool glissando in there too. But it is not over yet. As the massive tutti chord from earlier fades out, another sound creeps in. The violins, violas, and double basses come together with limited numbers to play this dissonant yet jazzy chord. The listener wonders what the purpose of this chord could be, when another noise interrupts that train of thought completely. In the background, low E fifths from the second harpists bite at the string chord. That's foreshadowing right there. The first harp using bass clef harmonics, plays the main motif, but now it sounds quite haunting and empty. All the fun and laughter is gone. The strings come in far stronger now, with all desks rejoining except for basses, creating a type of extremely emotionally conflicted sound that we haven't heard since perhaps Saturn or Venus. The second harp bites back immediately after that, with the first harp following with the main motif again. The bassoons then come back, pretending nothing really happened there, and playing the motif. They, along with the bass oboe, bass clarinet, and contrabassoon, harmonize together into one more demented statement. The tubas take the motif from them, drawing it out longer as the timpani plays a solo-marked passage, getting faster and louder. Suddenly the brass comes back, accompanied by the strings on the same line. The motif reaches its highest point and like a hammer crashes down. The various bass instruments of the orchestra land on a powerful E, which is immediately followed by the chord from the start of this unsettling section, but now with such extreme force it almost completely absorbs the E below it, but can't due to the sheer dissonance it creates. Another E comes crashing down, but with less force to it, causing the follow-up chord to have less force to balance. The timpani and low strings strike the bass E again, now barely at a mezzo forte, with only some low flutes and the bassoons to follow it. From here, things begin to slowly fade into obscurity, into the void of space, as we are eventually left with two extremely soft E-fifths at the end. To conclude the analysis of Uranus, it is a very fun but dangerous piece of music. For some reason, I feel like this is like the devil's music. It lures you in with silly motives, goofy melodies, and a fun march, but it gets progressively more insane until its own lunacy destroys itself. It's not quite the devil, but it gives similar vibes. Also, I try to refrain from making too many stupid jokes, because it is difficult to make these sorts of jokes sound tasteful, but there are still a few in there, if you listen closely. Some of them might have flew over your head or flew straight into your The orchestra has shrunken greatly. One piccolo, two flutes, alto flute in G, two oboes, English horn, bass oboe, three clarinets in A, bass clarinet, three bassoons, and double bassoon. That is for the woodwinds. Normally, for quieter movements like this, you would expect the brass to take more of a back seat, but that would be wrong. 4 horns, 4 trumpets, and 3 tenor trombones. Just no tubas. 3 timpani, 1 player, instead of the usual 6 timpani, 2 players. Percussion, marked vaguely, and celesta. And the celesta will be very important. Finally, 2 harps, organ pedal, 2 female choruses. Now that's interesting. And of course, strings. We begin rather mysteriously with a flute and alto flute playing chopped up harmonies. These harmonies outline a sort of melody, but this melody is nothing grand like the other movements. The intriguing harmony is far more important. The flutes reach a high point, transitioning to piccolo on top of 2 oboes, which hold a G sharp minor chord. From the darkness, 3 trombones come in with an A minor chord that clashes heavily with the woodwinds. The piccolo and oboes attempt to resolve this dissonance, but it is only until the trombones leave that things become more harmonically stable. The flutes return again, now accompanied by harps using the soft technique of bisbigliando. I hope I said that right. They once again trade off with the piccolo and oboes, the harps leaving as well. Instead of trombones, 4 horns come in with a C major chord, which although still dissonant with the G sharp minor chord, it is a lot more forgiving and kind sounding than before. This then leads into the flutes playing a significantly altered version of the previous motif, now sounding less mysterious and more hopeful. But the harps in the background do take away from that feeling slightly. The first oboe takes over this more hopeful line, and with the second oboe and English horn leads into figure 1. The original melodic figure now returns, with the celesta providing more harmony above. The violins and violas have also joined, adding more harmonic context as well. The melodic figure, instead of resting on some dissonant harmony, continues to expand until it consumes the majority of the woodwind section. In a way, this is similar to the cello moments in Venus, that all came before an important chord. We were building up to something. And that something is a chord, but it is not grandiose by any means. When we finally land on that chord, despite the dynamics not changing at all, it is quite shocking and intense. Trumpets and trombones introduce us to an E minor chord over a G sharp fifth. This is extremely dissonant, and the harp and strings in the background only emphasize the terrifying beauty of it. We very temporarily translate to G sharp minor over an E fifth, a clever way to create an equally dissonant chord without having to completely change the notes or intervals. At figure 2, the woodwinds take over the role of the sustain chords from the brass, while the celesta does most of the arpeggio work. This sounds just as haunting, if not a little lighter. This pattern continues with varying degrees of unique chords that come into dangerously close contact with each other, creating dissonance. One thing you will notice with this movement is that it is mostly harmony, lacking a lot of thematic material, and the orchestra is used in clever ways to carry this harmony in the spookiest way possible. Tremolo strings build up in chords, with the woodwinds providing a soft yet terrifying pad. Later, we experience more crazy arpeggios, with the heavy brass providing soft yet dissonant chords, now in quicker succession than before. These arpeggios continue on in various forms for many pages of score, until figure 4, where things take a quick breather, with the celesta taking the lead. We get more arpeggios before things are led into a much darker tone. At figure 5, the tempo is increased, but we don't notice that until the cellos begin a leading up figure that will define a good chunk of the rest of the piece. The bass oboe takes this line from the cellos before passing it on to the English horn and oboes, all harmonizing each other in different, equally unnerving ways. As if from outer space, heavenly voices descend upon our ears. The choir, which is in an adjacent room, invisible to the audience, has joined with sustained G's, while the horns take the climbing motif that the oboes had just earlier. Things transition into flats, which in this harmonic context creates a more pleasant and hopeful sound. Eventually, however, the melody floats back into mystery. The choir takes the rising motif directly now, with both of them overlapping in many unique ways. The flutes and harps accompany the singers, creating an eerie effect. This continues on with great repetitive effect until the choir ends on a held high chord. Suddenly, the rest of the orchestra returns with a soft yet extremely intense chord, followed by quick arpeggios. These arpeggios eventually build up into the last bars of Neptune. The choir is doing something similar to just earlier, with parts of the orchestra supporting them. The support is coming from flutes, clarinet, celesta, harps, and violins. At the end, the harps do these truly mystical glissandos until eventually we end up on the last bar. Two chords sung by the choirs to be repeated until the sound is lost in the distance. This was Holst's experimental harmony playground. So many insane chords are present here. The E minor over G sharp minor and so many more really shake you to the bone. Many first-time listeners are dissuaded by this movement, but that's all the more reason to put it at the very end of the suite. Once you've heard Uranus, Neptune isn't as hard of a blow. Speaking of which, let's talk about some reasons why Neptune was put last, despite having a creepy undertone and a fade-out ending, aspects not usual to an orchestral finale. The main reason is, of course, that Neptune is the last planet, so it deserves the final spot, but Mercury and Mars got switched, so what gives? Well, Holst focused a lot on musical effectiveness, and in this case, with Neptune, he gave himself a strange challenge: how to end things mysteriously. That's why he chose the fade-out chorus, with the door to the adjacent room slowly closing as the choir gets softer and softer. Space might as well be infinite, most of it unknown, and especially back in Holst's time, anything beyond Neptune was a real mystery, both in astrology and actual astronomy. Now that we have looked at the smaller details that make up each movement and touched lightly on the structures of each planet and the overarching structure, it is time to view the larger picture more extensively. Each movement has its own unique structure that you could infer from the previous part of the analysis. However, there are many similarities between the structures of each movement, and also ways they could combine together to create a plethora of beautiful musical narratives. In the second and final part of the analysis, I will be doing what I avoided in my last large-scale analysis, that being the Rite of Spring video, where I did not look at the larger picture beyond surface level meaning, and this time I will actually be giving you a proper and complete analysis. The planets can be split into two halves based on movement structure. The first half consists of the first four movements, the second half is the last three. What separates these two halves of the suite structurally? Well, allow me to explain. Mars and Venus, despite being polar opposites in many ways, have a similar structure. I'm not saying they have the same structure, just that there are key similarities. They both begin with introducing the main thematic material. From there they throw in new melodies and ideas. Some are developed later, others are not developed as much. Then a large climax occurs before recapping the old material. This does seem like a simple and vague structure, which it is, but it does show up throughout the suite a lot, which is what I'm mainly commenting on. Both pieces use this structure differently, however. For example, the climax of Mars is actually where the recap begins technically, while Venus's climax involves a unique melody that is never heard again after the section it is born in. This is a significant point to bring up when discussing the difference in structure, however. It only looks at the structure through this lens of thematic material and development, and even then I just discussed how they share similar moments of thematic development elsewhere, mainly the recap sections of each movement. What if I told you Mercury also has a similar structure to those two? Let's pull up the criteria. Introduces main thematic material, goes on a bit of a tangent, climax in the staccato area, then recap of original material. Also, a coda 2. In some form or another, these three movements have a coda. Very different codas, obviously, but they still share the structural element. Now let's look at Jupiter. The fourth movement structure is a classic ABA form, but extended greatly. This ABA plus coda form is a very boiled down version of how the first four movements work, including Jupiter. Once again, I'm going to say the criteria. They introduce main thematic material, in Jupiter's case. In order to fit with the overall ABA, each A must be subdivided due to Jupiter's complex, not really complex, but for the sake of this complex structure. Then the movement reaches a climax in the B section before recapping everything again, but with some changes. And of course, the coda at the end. Hopefully after this you were able to see that it is clear that these first four movements, Mars, Venus, Mercury, and Jupiter, all have similar structures to each other. However, Holst was able to manipulate this simple ABA plus coda structure into four unique structures with their own wonderful characteristics. Let's once again look at the climaxes of each piece and see how they relate to each other. Mars recaps the introduction, now with far more intensity and vigor. Venus brings in a new melody before rising and falling into a devastating chord. Mercury goes crazy with strings and woodwinds, creating satisfying polyrhythms and harmonies. And finally, Jupiter takes its main motif and weaves a beautiful and timeless melody that reaches its end on a sus4 chord. Yes, even though they have similar structures, the climax shows that it is still flexible. That is the genius of it. And there are many other sections in these pieces that I could talk about for ages, literal days probably, but the climax is the best way to highlight this point. Now, what about Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune? Why were they not included above? Why are they different, structurally speaking? To sum it up quickly, while the first four movements play nicely with the ABA plus coda structure, these last three movements either turn it into something completely different or completely tear it to shreds and start anew. As a recap, let's look at how each movement handles its structure. Saturn begins with introducing the main idea as well as the oscillating harmonic material. The main theme is developed before reaching a mini climax, now much more developed. From here, a chordal section emerges that builds and builds until launching the listener into a different sort of recap. Things are much faster, and the main motif is far more cutting and devastating, especially with the brass chord. Things slow down with more recap before dying down into something far more emotionally different. The main theme is developed even more, and we experience several key changes as the textures and orchestration change. Finally, we are greeted with some last chordal moments before fading into the distance. Saturn's structure is vaguely similar to the ABA plus coda, but it goes far beyond that. If you were to try to squeeze Saturn into the structural box, it wouldn't quite work. A section would be the very beginning, B section could be the development and the chords, A section repeated would become the climax and right after the climax, while the coda would be the entire last section, which, by the way, is a few minutes. That seems like it works, but it just isn't very clear, and it doesn't follow how the other movements did it. The climax being in the repeated A section could work, as seen with Mars, but it just doesn't quite fall in with the first four movements, with their climax almost always being at the end of the B section. And of course, the most glaring problem of all, shoving the entire ending into the coda and calling it a day. Sure, codas can be quite long sometimes, even taking up a third of the piece, but they are generally separate from the piece as a whole, thematically speaking. The ending of Saturn almost exclusively develops the main motif. In a very loose definition of coda, it does bring the piece to an end in a unique way, emotionally speaking, but I would label it with its own letter and instead call it its entire section. You could label it as a C section or even the D section if you wanted to split up the structure even more. This section of Saturn is too significant to just be a coda. Now moving on, Uranus begins with stating its main motif before going on a bit of a tangent. The first section of Uranus involves a lot of staccato, with some fragments of melody and the main motif thrown in too. Things build into a completely unrelated and psychotic melody that is a section in its own right. The melody reaches a peak, then fizzled out into some obvious restatements of the main motif, just in case we forgot. After that, we are greeted with the goofy march and its goofy melody. This section does an excellent job at not only introducing a brand new idea, but also developing it quite effectively too, and in only the span of a minute until the climax of the piece. Speaking of the peak, this is the goofy melody, but now in a much more psychotic light, which ends on a huge chord that seems to be the end of the piece, but there's more. This comes in through the soft ending section, which turns into brutal stacked chords that fade into space. I think it's pretty obvious here that Uranus does not follow the ABA plus coda structure at all, really. There is not much thematic unity other than the main motif, and any ABA structure requires a restatement of the theme or themes in the A section, or the sections that comprise it. Uranus loves to go on little tangents that turn into big and sometimes insane adventures, before quickly moving on to the next thing. Breaking down the structure as is, it would be AB, representing the first two sections, then a transition, then C, which is the goofy march, then finally D, or the coda, which would be the ending. The ending in many ways is like a coda, being connected to the rest of the piece but not too closely, and in this case providing extreme emotional contrast. So, you could label the D section as a coda if you wanted to. Therefore, we have an ABC plus coda going on here. This lack of unity does not mean the structure and thematic development of the piece is bad. There is the main motif after all. Just that there are far less major through lines and more tiny threads that hold the magician's tricks together. Ah, Neptune, where do I even begin? Well, first of all, I think it is clear that this structure is not even vaguely related to the ABA plus coda structure of the first four movements. Saturn imitated the structure, but was not fully authentic, and Uranus deviated quite heavily. Neptune forgets it even existed. Not to say that Neptune was just a harmonic or orchestration experiment, just that the structure is quite unconventional. although it was a harmonic and orchestration experiment as well, but it did have an actual structure. The overarching developments are less important than the pacing here. A good way to describe Neptune is spooky melody, then spooky chords, then spooky arpeggios. Ooh, a chorus. More spooky chords. Chorus fades out. This movement overall just makes my head hurt so much. Even after going over the score dozens of times, there are still many things that evade my analytical understanding. But overall, I would say that the structure of Neptune would be closer to Uranus's because it's just more free form compared to the others and goes in its own directions and loves to go on tangents a lot. But definitely not related to the ABA plus coda structure really at all. Overall, the structures of the first four movements are relatively the same. The ABA plus coda structure is such a nice starting point for planning new music, coming from a composer myself. You introduce your main points, go in a different direction to everything before that point, then return to your original themes in a nice recap section before tying it off with a unique coda. It is also very nice to have a contrast in structures between the first half of the suite and the second half. I just question why Holst did not spread the structures out more, instead of having four very similar movements, structurally speaking, right beside each other. This does work, of course, as I think I'm starting to look at things a little too closely with a bit too much of a tunnel vision here. As at the end of the day, the emotional significance is generally what matters more here, because all the movements are so emotionally distinct from each other. But in this section, I mainly wanted to detail the structural perspective of the suite. When it comes to the multi-movement structure of the planets, Holst took great inspiration from Schoenberg. Schoenberg's 5 pieces for orchestra were described as not being cyclically related and being rather short, generally only a few minutes in length. The same description holds up for the planets rather well. 7 pieces, all of which are less than 10 minutes in length, that can theoretically be played in any order. Of course, Holst intended his piece to be played in the correct order of movement numbers, but even today, a lot of orchestras decide to play only one movement or omit movements. Compare that to any symphony, where it is relatively common, or rather basically necessary, to play the entire structure, all movements in correct order, unless of course a single movement is extremely popular, like Beethoven's 7-second movement. For the sake of this part of the analysis, I will be looking at the overall structure of the suite as Holst intended. The original order will always be considered first. There are many viewpoints that surround the structure and its meaning, but they are inherently subjective, and so my opinions will be more prevalent than usual for this section. The first look I have for the overall structure and meaning involve the maturity of a person and how they grow and change. Mars is the fiery youth, the almost unforgivable brashness phase that many people go through when young. Venus follows that up with a peaceful and forgiving reaction, more mature than Mars, but still wallowing in self-pity. Mercury is still relatively young in someone's life, but far more mature than Mars, representing graceful wit and the urge to never stop. Jupiter, perhaps the peak of many people's lives, is the time of jollity, of course, having fun, connecting with others, perhaps even being Mr. Large and in charge, but always happy. This is immediately followed by Saturn, the midlife crisis, a far more depressive and imminent phase than Venus because now there's fear. However, by the end of Saturn, that fear has been abolished and the person lets go of any scary thoughts about growing older. Uranus is the last hurrah for many, a time of using your wisdom and knowledge to play around with the world a bit before crashing and burning. And Neptune is a last goodbye, saying goodbye to the world and embracing the mysterious beyond. I really like this way of looking at the meaning and structure of this piece. The distinctions between the movements is highlighted even more through this, and it makes you wonder, where am I? But obviously, don't let some musical suite determine your entire personality, or astrology as a whole for that matter. This perspective of the planets simply gives us a unique look at the piece and how it relates to the human condition. According to the next theory, all the movements other than Jupiter have a parallel. Mars is opposite to Neptune, Venus's opposite is Uranus, and Mercury with Saturn, with Jupiter joyously in the center. Technically, or rather objectively, I think, each movement contrasts the one before it in one way or another, but the biggest contrasts are the opposites mentioned just earlier. This presents another way to look at the structure. The warlike and aggressive nature of Mars is a stark contrast to the subdued yet mysterious feeling that Neptune emits. The delicacy and grace of Venus is the foil of Uranus's vulgarness and complete lack of grace and subtlety. Mercury's quick wit and playful manner goes greatly against Saturn's lethargic, serious, and anxious manner. Although this way of looking at the multi-movement structure is sort of an extension of the previous mentioned meaning, this theory provides a lot of insight and unique characteristics to each movement. And it also shows why things were structured the way they were. Just imagine the sound of Uranus coming right after Mars. That would be unforgiving to the ears. Or Venus right after Jupiter. It could still work, but it would be not as optimal as Saturn's even colder opening. Of course, another reason the movements were structured the way they are is that it is the astronomical order, the physical order of the planets. But Holst did decide to switch around Mars and Mercury for maximum musical effectiveness. As said earlier, one of Holst's main musical influences was Five Pieces for Orchestra by Arnold Schoenberg. But you may listen to that piece and think, how could such a beautiful and tonal work be inspired by an atonal yet glorious abomination? Not only did both pieces push the boundaries of orchestral music, but Holst himself went to a performance of Schoenberg's piece and even bought the score for personal study. Let's dig into the influences here. In the second movement of Five Pieces for Orchestra, it opens up directly with the devastation chord, the same type of chord used in several of the movements in the planets. However, it is resolved differently. Instead of going to a major chord, it becomes something just as dissonant when the top note leaps downwards. The devastation chord was used notably in Mars, specifically at the end, the first quadruple forte climax where the devastation chord resolves to its major counterpoint. So, from D flat add sharp 4 over C to D flat over F. This chord is also used notably in Uranus just after figure 4, being in the form of an A add sharp 4 chord that slams into your ears. Note that Schoenberg used this chord delicately in the second movement of his Five Pieces for Orchestra, while Holst turns it into something much more powerful and prevalent throughout his orchestration generally. It is not a huge stretch to think that Holst was inspired to put this chord in his piece due to Five Pieces for Orchestra. One, it's a really cool chord, and very versatile too, as seen with Schoenberg's and Holst's different interpretations of it. And two, as previously mentioned, Holst not only listened to the piece live, he also studied the score on his own time. Of course, he would have picked up on something as fascinating as this, and like a good artist said, "It's mine." Just by listening to Mars, it is clear that Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring has a huge influence on the suite. The double-stop string chords about a quarter through Mars are reminiscent of the orchestration and harmony of the start of Augurs of Spring. The tenor tuba solo that plays over the chords is also vaguely reminiscent of the various related melodic lines found in the Augurs of Spring. Of course, the Rite of Spring is far more complex in orchestration and harmony than the planets, but similarities like this are enough to show clear influence. Also in Mars, the chaotic woodwind runs are also reminiscent of many excerpts from the Rite of Spring. The main difference is that most of the runs in the Rite are chocked full of overlapping tuplets and other rhythmic elements, while Mars generally uses just 16th notes. This could be an influence, but the similarity between the two pieces in terms of their woodwind runs could just be due to the similar size of the woodwind families, allowing these things to happen more. This could just be me making too much speculation out of this. 5 pieces for orchestra in the Rite of Spring may have been the main influence on Holst's composing, but there were a few other musical influences to talk about, even if they were not as significant overall. The Sorcerer's Apprentice by Paul Dukas is a prime example of this. The bouncy rhythms and bassoon-centered orchestration found in various passages sound a lot like Uranus the Magician. And of course, speaking of the non-musical influences, there is Holst's obsession with astrology and its influence on the suite. Listen to the suite and you will get to hear that firsthand. And I will tell you some information about Holst and his relationship with astrology. He was introduced to it by his friends when they holidayed in Spain, as mentioned earlier. Much earlier, actually. His obsession grew more and more, and it became common for him to do horoscopes for his friends, which was a fun activity for Holst. The planets originally started as something fully astrological, but due to social pressures, he removed the names of the planets for each movement. A certain figure in the astrological world was prosecuted due to his behaviors as a quote-unquote thief, and so Holst wanted to hide the true inspiration of his music and simply name it 7 pieces for large orchestra. It was only until some short time before the premiere that Holst decided to change the names back to their original forms, basically at the last minute, feeling it would resonate with the audience better. And it did. The piece was received very strongly with mixed criticism. I know I'm starting to get into the reception of the piece, but it was very strong due to the potency of the movements, which were based on astrological personalities taken to their extremes. Alright, this is a cool part. How did the cinematic and massive orchestral piece impact the world? Specifically, how did it impact music from the point it was composed onwards? Well, I have quite a few examples, some pretty obvious, others more vague. Let's start with film music. Obviously, Star Wars is the strongest example of musical influence from the planets. Before John Williams began writing the soundtrack for A New Hope, George Lucas was using Holst's music as a backdrop for many of the scenes. Mars was a particularly strong influence. The smashing dissonant chords and battle scenes, as well as the Imperial March, all point to influences from Mars. Many of the more thoughtful or desolate passages in Williams' soundscapes point towards other movements like Venus, Saturn, or Neptune. Various other sci-fi movies like Alien also drew inspiration from the planets. Alien's soundtrack is vaguely reminiscent of the opening of Saturn, although Jerry Goldsmith, the composer, went for his unique approaches more often than taking direct inspiration from anybody, unlike George Lucas's instructions to John Williams. And then there's Star Trek. As you would expect from a more overarching war and conflict-based sci-fi space story, so space opera, it takes inspiration from Mars a decent amount in its soundtrack. Several years after the premiere of The Planets, the hymn from Jupiter was put to use outside of the orchestral setting. Sir Cecil Spring Rice was a man who had written a poem about the connection between the United Kingdom and heaven. This poem was later turned to song when it was set to the chorale from Jupiter, which actually worked quite well with the minimal changes to the original melody. This song has stood the test of time, being regarded as one of the most important and influential British hymns. It has been and is used for solemn and respectful events like the funeral of Winston Churchill as well as Princess Diana, while being used every year in Remembrance Day events. It is truly a beautiful song, combining the expert craftsmanship of two great British artists. A notable example of the planets being used directly in animation is none other than the Australian shows Bluey, specifically the episode Sleepy Time. This episode of the popular children's cartoon utilizes Jupiter quite heavily, beginning with only references of the main motif, and as the episode progresses, it develops slowly until the middle section. Personally, this is one of the most emotionally stirring moments in a kid's show I've seen, and I don't even have any context to this show. The music helps that much, and the composer decided to stay mostly faithful to the original orchestration of the chorale, just throwing in some celesta, which sounded beautiful. To sum it all up, The Planets is an excellent piece of orchestral music in nearly every way possible. The orchestration in particular, despite being simpler than some other pieces during the same time, served as a solid baseline for orchestral endeavors by future composers. Furthermore, the melody and harmony of this piece is also exquisite due to the catchiness and general simplicity in certain cases that they possess. And finally, the spectacular moods this piece manages to convey through the aforementioned qualities is another point in its favor. This piece would not be as popular as it is and influential as it is if it were not for the vivid opening of Mars, the beautiful chorale of Jupiter, and the mysterious fade out of Neptune, as well as many other key moments. Congratulations on making it to the end of this video, essay, and analysis. I give you my greatest thanks for sticking around to the end. I just have a few things to say before I go, so if you're interested in the channel, this will be valuable to you. First of all, I would like to mention this is the second time I have ever made a video like this. The first time was the Rite of Spring is Terrifying video. I will admit that video was not my best work, but many of you really seem to enjoy it. That's why I made this one, a far better and longer analysis that can actually be considered a proper analysis rather than just a quick rundown of the piece's fundamentals and its sequence. And of course, the piece in question here is The Planet, a work that I have studied far more closely than The Rite of Spring. This project has been extremely enjoyable, although video editor me might think otherwise due to the massive workload, but writer me and voiceover me is very pleased with how this is all coming along. I don't know why I didn't put this before, but if you are looking for more resources to study this work, I highly recommend checking out Orchestration Online's video lecture series on the planets. They are far more thorough than this video and told by someone much more experienced in the art of making music. I also owe a great deal of knowledge from that series, much of which was translated almost directly to this video. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's talk about the future of the channel specifically. I have a few questions for you, loyal viewer. Would you like to see more videos like this? More full-scale analysis of orchestral pieces? If so, which ones would you be most interested in? I can't guarantee anything, but I will certainly look at the comments for suggestions. And speaking of suggestions, any ways to improve my videos would also be highly appreciated. The right video got a lot of valid criticism, which helped this video be far better than that one. Thank you to those that sent those comments last time. It truly helped. Thank you all for watching, and keep making better music.